app.
Welcome back, Vancouver Province columnist Mike Smith filling in for Simi today. One of the great embarrassments for this city is the lack of ride-sharing services. We are the largest city in North America that does not have Uber, Lyft, other ride-sharing services. The biggest city where these services are still illegal. Isn't that interesting that we got the highest gas prices in North America and we're the only major city in North America that does not have these ride-sharing services? This is ridiculous. When is this going to be fixed? Earlier this morning, Coquitlam Mayor Richard Stewart spoke with Simi Sara about the story of an elderly woman in a wheelchair who waited 3 hours in the rain on Canada Day for a taxi she had pre-booked. Here's Richard Stewart describing what happened.
It was astounding. We were at the end of the night. I had just gone into the command center to congratulate the team that had put it all together. Fireworks were wonderful, a little bit of rain, a lot of rain actually, and I found out there that there was one incident they were still trying to manage, and so I went over to it. My daughter and I went over to it. She knew where it was, and I discovered Merle, one of our Coquitlam residents, in a wheelchair. She's aging, and she's the two of them, her and her sister, are soaking wet. They're both frail and have health issues. And they'd been waiting since, my understanding is 8:30. They had a 9 o'clock taxi booked. They'd been trying to reach the taxi company since then. The taxi company kept promising 20 more minutes. And it was now 11. It was well after 11. We had to call a fire truck over that was at the festival, and they assessed her. They called in paramedics. They assessed both of them and were concerned, but both of them insisted that they can wait for their taxi. But when the taxi finally did arrive, it was after midnight.
Does this sound like a familiar story to you? Has this happened to you, to someone in your family, to someone that you know? I want to hear from you on the open line on this. Mayor Stewart, he also spoke about how this is becoming increasingly common, increasingly difficult for passengers with disabilities to book a taxi that's wheelchair accessible. Here he is.
There are several taxi companies at this point. There's only one that serves Coquitlam legally, but we often have to call the Royal City Taxi over in New Westminster, for example, and they will sometimes come with their wheelchair vans to pick up one of our residents who needs transportation. And due to the unreliability that we've experienced with particularly with wheelchair taxis from the provider here in Coquitlam.
Let's check in now with Iain Black. He's the president and CEO of the Vancouver Board of Trade. Hello, Iain.
Good morning, Mike, and to your listeners.
Thanks a lot for coming in. What do you think of that story?
You know, I'd love to tell you it's the first story of its kind that I've heard. I mean, we've been a strong advocate for getting into the ride-sharing framework for many years now, and we actually published basically a how-to guide for the provincial government of the day back in February 2016, outlining the very four specific things that need to be done to bring the city kicking and screaming into the 21st century when it comes to these kind of offerings for our tourists and for our residents. And it's a bit of a head scratcher that we're no further ahead now than we were well over 2 years ago now.
Why do you have you ever used the Uber service yourself when you're traveling outside of British Columbia?
Yeah, I travel extensively, both in North America, and I've been fortunate enough to be in Europe a fair bit. And in fact, in a recent trip to London, England, where I was for a conference just a few months ago, I used equal number of cabs and in my case Uber, but there's several ride-sharing options available, Lyft amongst others, that I use regularly when I'm traveling. And it's an absolute no-brainer to have these options available to our citizens for issues around safety, accommodation of people with disabilities, and frankly, getting drug driving stats down where they should be, about 30% lower, which is what's happened in Edmonton and Nashville as a result of implementing these services.
Okay, I'm speaking to Iain Black from the Vancouver Board of Trade, which is a part of a new coalition pushing for ride-sharing services in our province. When you speaking of taxis and this poor woman waiting for this taxi for 3 hours in the rain, You know, when you speak to the taxi drivers, and I've interviewed them over the last couple of years for stuff I've done in the province newspaper on this issue, and you talk to a guy who has mortgaged his house in order to buy not just a taxi license, I'm talking about a share in a taxi license, because that's how expensive these licenses are as they're traded on the market. They mortgage their home to run a small business with a taxi license. I understand this. Like, I understand how they feel afraid of the competition. They've put all this money into running a small business. They want to be protected. I get that. I understand it. It's just human nature. But when you take a look at around other cities, like I know you've done, what is the experience for the taxi industry in other cities? I mean, do they all just dry up and go away?
Well, I do not get into a cab anywhere when I travel without asking this question, because it's become because it's so obvious to us that we have to move here for city reputational reasons, if nothing else. That I canvass this of every cab driver that I get a chance to sit with, and the answer goes something like this: there was a bit of a bump at first, but since then we have basically seen no change in service. We've recovered the business that we thought we would lose, and this is for two reasons, Mike. One is that, particularly in our case, we have the lowest number of cabs per capita in Canada, as well as the highest taxi fares. So there's absolutely room for more business here. But you look at the city of Brampton, who recently released a report where they talked about not only was there an immaterial change in the use of taxis, but a tremendous growth in the use of ride-sharing, which tells us that they're two different customer sets. So it's not a case of an either-or. There's a room for both in the system, and report after report from around the world has shown this to be true. And including in Brampton's case, you saw an increase of about 18% in the use of transit, quite separate from what happened with the cabs and the ride-sharing companies, which tell us that they're a critical part of the formula for this intermodal, if you will, the next generation of citizens who don't necessarily even want to own a car, but they need options to go from, whether it's renting a bike to get them to a transit station, which takes them to a place where they can catch a ride share or a taxi as an option. It's part of a broader ecosystem of transportation that the next generation has already embraced.
Right. I think you just raised an excellent point about people who would like to get rid of their car. I mean, the price of gas is just sick right now. It's $1.60 a liter. It's going to go up again. And for people who don't have access to adequate access to transit, a lot of people have got no option but to get behind the wheel of their car. You know what? You give them a ride-sharing option where they know that when they use the app on their phone that they're going to get an efficient, quick, reasonably priced ride that's going to show up in a matter of minutes, because that's certainly been my experience every time I've used Uber in any other city outside of this province. The system works perfectly. You give them that option, then they have the option to get rid of their car, right? I mean, this is the most expensive city in the country to live in. Like, the cost of living in this city is crazy. Let's give people some options here so they can get rid of a car, so they don't have to pay for gas. They don't have to pay their ICBC. If you have a ride-sharing option that's going to work for them. And I think this government, and I must say, with all due respect to you, Iain, the former Liberal government as well, and you're a former Liberal MLA, they should both hang their heads in shame that this service is still not available to the people of this province. It's outrageous.
Well, and you know, it's funny because I miss many things about being in public life. I've been out of it now for longer than I was in it, and very proud of the time that I spent there, and a thrilling opportunity to have that privilege. But this is one of the things that I don't miss about it, is that this is, in my view, a matter of political will. When we published the report in February of 2016, it was a playbook in terms of what needed to be done to introduce a new regulatory framework that would be helpful, to review and update the taxi regulations so that you don't devastate the taxi industry as it exists today, because it desperately needs an overhaul, including things like regional licensing structure so that you can have greater intercity services and the elimination of duplicate permitting, which is crazy that we have that. Also, updating the Passenger Transportation Act, which hasn't been touched for a decade, that has to reflect things like the incentives and requirements to ensure that accessible services for seniors and the disabled are actually met and not interrupted. And then finally the ICBC piece, which is pretty self-explanatory, I suppose. They need a customized offering of insurance for these guys, but that's not rocket science. It already exists on the shelf.
Yeah, it can be done. It's being done everywhere else except here. Iain Black, Vancouver Board of Trade, talking Uber, ride-sharing, taxis, 604-280-9898. Let's go to your calls. Hi, Chris.
I'm a chauffeur. I've been chauffeur for 25 years off and on. This isn't ride-sharing. It's actually ride-hailing. And it's not going to add much value to the city. It's very unregulated. The drivers, you could, be any type of driver and drive for them. I mean, it's not healthy. And it's showing now in some cities in the U.S. I just heard of a city, I don't know which one it was, but they said they were implementing a 500% tax on Uber because people were abandoning their jobs at Uber. It's not working out.
Chris, you got to be kidding me. You got to be kidding me, man. You're not going to add any value to this city? That is ridiculous. Have you ever used the Uber service outside of this province? Hello? I don't know. Did he just bail on me?
No, I'm here.
Okay, thank you. Have you ever used the service yourself, Uber?
Yes, I have.
And you're telling me there's no value with it?
None at all. The drivers are very unprofessional. No, they're very unprofessional. They don't know the city, and it's going to add more traffic to the city, Mike. You wait. And as far as I'm sorry about the handicapped lady that was waiting for a cab the other night.
Yeah.
Those handicapped taxis are not on the road at that time of night. They never are. They're only on the road during the day. I don't know why that is, but
in the city,
they're only on the road during the day.
Let me try to educate you a little bit on this. In the city of Toronto, where they've got the Uber service and they've worked with the disability community there to make sure there is an adequate supply of wheelchair accessible cars there, the average wait time in the city of Toronto for a wheelchair accessible Uber car is under 10 minutes. 10
do you think
minutes.
That'll work here? Do you think?
Yes, I do. It'd be a hell of a lot better than waiting 3 hours in the rain.
Oh, I agree.
I'll tell you that.
But I do know that those kind of taxi cabs do not operate during the evening, Mike. They only operate during the day. I see them. I see them all the time.
Chris, when you have the limousine industry, like I guess the one you work for, or the taxi industry saying, don't let this service operate here. It's like the payphone industry saying you should make cell phones illegal. It's like the horse and buggy industry saying don't legalize automobiles. This is crazy. Times change. Technology changes. Every other major city in North America has got with the program except us. This is an embarrassment. It's actually hurting our economy. I've spoken to people who've had trouble arranging conferences in this city when they find out there's no ride sharing here. This is crazy.
Well, my company does do a lot of conferences, and we handle thousands of people. So I don't know who you're talking to, but
I've talked to people in the business sector that have had trouble getting people into the city to do major events when they find out that we're living in the Stone Age and they don't have access to ride sharing and they can't get around the city.
Well, we're doing
Mike,
a group
if
right
I can
now.
get in this for a second. Like
okay,
if I can get
Chris,
in, I just worked
go
with the
ahead.
tourism guys and the hotel guys last week, and they'll absolutely validate the concern from a tourism and conference standpoint. But no, Chris does make one really important point, if I can just touch on it. He talked about safety standards. That's why one of the 4 recommendations we made in February of 2016 was around a new provincial framework that needs to be done with respect to safety standards for drivers, vehicles, and activities which are reflective of the particular business model. So in other words, review all the standards and make sure that anyone participating in the ride-hailing or ride-sharing industry is at least meeting the minimum standards of the taxi industry, but frankly revisit those as well, because the issues around cab safety, the standard of those vehicles, and the quality of those drivers is one of the biggest concerns that currently exists for that industry.
But you just said yourself a short time ago, Iain, that it's not rocket science. You bring in the regulations. If you had a government with some kind of political will, as you put it, and they weren't in the pockets of the taxi industry and in bed with them, and I include your former Liberal Party in that as well, we would have these services and we would have the proper regulations in place to ensure that people get a safe ride.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. I don't think it's a case of being in the pockets of it, because being in the pockets implies political donations. I don't think that's the issue. I do think it's tricky politics, though. And let's pretend for just a moment.
Okay, we got a minute left.
Okay, you've got two guys in central Vancouver, George Heyman and David Eby, who have been whacked by their constituents around the asset tax that the provincial government has brought down, dressed up as a school tax. They need some political relief because they got tons of people in their community who actually would use this service. Here's the problem. The taxi industry is a great block vote, particularly in South Vancouver and in Surrey, which any reasonable assessment of the last election was a determinant in the outcome. That's the tricky politics. It's not about being in somebody's pocket. It's about block votes of a very powerful lobby.
Thank you for coming on today.
My pleasure.
I just finished doing a segment on ride-sharing services in British Columbia and lack thereof. Mm-hmm. Still the largest city in North America where Uber and Lyft and these other services are illegal. This incredible story that the Coquitlam Mayor Richard Stewart was sharing today about the elderly woman in a wheelchair. She waits 3 hours in the rain for a taxi. You know, to me, that's just one of the most graphic examples that I can think of for the glaring need for this service. You know, I've used this service when I've traveled outside of BC. Every other city's got it. I think it's an absolute embarrassment we don't have it here. I think both the major parties should hang their heads in shame that we don't have this. We just talked about it, took a bunch of calls on it. What is the current status of this in BC? Are we ever going to get this, or where's it at right now?
Well, we had an all-party committee issue a report back in the spring, and now it's been punted off until next spring at the earliest, according to Premier John Horgan. I sense, in talking to both the NDP and the BC Liberals, I sense no real fire in the belly in either party to get this thing done. It doesn't seem to be a priority issue for either party. I think both are still afraid of the entrenched taxi industry, particularly in Surrey. You keep in mind, so many policies right now are determined in large ways because of the electoral result last year, where the election was decided in literally a handful of ridings in the Metro Vancouver, in Burnaby, the Tri-Cities, Maple Ridge, and Surrey. That's where the election is won or lost. That's where the taxi industry is most powerful, and South Vancouver. And that's why I think you see both parties really sort of not talking about it unless they're asked.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I just spoke to Iain Black, the CEO of the Vancouver Board of Trade, who, of course, is a former Liberal MLA, a former Liberal cabinet minister. And I said to him, you know, the NDP and your party, your former party, the Liberal Party, you're both in bed with the taxi industry. And he corrected me and he said, no, it's not the taxi industry. It's the electoral reality on the ground where you have a taxi industry that's dominated by the South Asian community, primarily the Indo-Canadian community, especially in riding in places like Surrey. This is a large, politically engaged, very sophisticated political community that vote. And they deliver people to vote, and both parties are scared to death to get them upset.
Yep. No. Again, some of these ridings were won by razor-thin margins, and if they make a wrong move on something like this, it could cost either party the riding. And right now, things are so tight politically. An election could happen literally at any time, and no one expects the outcome to be necessarily radically different than the outcome last May. Therefore, every riding is important, and if you lose one or two, you could lose your hold on power or your chance to hold power in the province. And that's why you see paralysis on a number of issues, because both parties are afraid to upset the electorate, and again, a relatively small number of write-ins.
The current status of this issue in BC is there's yet another review going on, and we'll probably get the results of this review in the fall. Then the official line from the government is we'll make a decision maybe by the end of the year, maybe next year, who knows. But someone in government said to me today, and this shows you how opposed they are to ride sharing, the woman who waited 3 hours in the rain for a taxi in a wheelchair, you think Uber is going to have do any better in getting people in a wheelchair for a ride? Listen, when you talk to Uber, they will say, yeah, we will do better. Because even Uber in this province, they've been doing consultation with the BC Spinal Cord Injury Association. They've actually consulted with the disabled community in this province how to make sure that we have enough accessible vehicles on the road. And it's been shown to work in other cities. In the city of Boston, I just learned this morning, the company Uber works with the Transit Authority in Boston to add a supplement to the fare to ensure that there's enough accessible Uber vehicles in Boston. So, this stuff is not rocket science. It can be done.
Well, Uber is trying to transform its image. It did have a PR problem, I think. Recently fired its CEO. It's got a new guy in charge. They're trying to clean up their image. They're trying to be more community-oriented. I think it's working in a lot of jurisdictions. They were kicked out of London, England for a number of reasons. They're trying to fight their way back in there. It's not just about Uber. There's also another competitor called Lyft. I've met with those people.
Just one company.
They're down in San Francisco. They've got a very high success rate there. They're very popular. So it's just it's a concept that doesn't have to be awarded to necessarily one particular company. But it's interesting. Every time I don't know about you, every time I talk to an NDP cabinet minister, MLA, and raise this issue, their first reaction is not a positive one. It's not, we're going to get this going. It's like, oh, no.
They don't want it.
And they start citing all the problems associated with it rather than all the positives potentially associated
and
with it.
And the Liberals
that's
are
very
the
telling.
same,
Yep.
like you said.
Not much difference with the BC Liberals.
They should both hang their heads
The only one who's been consistent on this all along is Andrew Weaver in the BC Green Party.
He's the only one who said just bring it in. Let's talk about the money laundering.